Okay, so we said that in theory what's going to happen as a firm expands its capacity, increase its scale, is that unit costs are going to go down. Yeah, so far what we said is that as we expanded, we said that as we expanded from short run average cost curve 1 to short run average cost curve 2, average cost came down and our long run average cost curve looked like that. But it's not necessarily the case that this is going to continue indefinitely. It's clearly possible that things are going to go wrong as you expand, and that instead of this kind of continued, kind of happy story, of kind of reduced costs, what starts happening, and we'll talk about why in a minute, is that actually bigger firms face problems, and instead of the short run average cost curve being driven down, our short run average cost curve starts to be driven up. So instead of having economies of scale, internal economies of scale, what starts to happen is that your long run average cost starts getting pushed upwards, and your average costs start to increase. So up until this point, our firm has economies of scale. After that point, it has diseconomies. After that point, it has diseconomies of scale, and your long run average cost curve. Therefore, in classic textbook theory, your long run average cost curve initially falls, before subsequently increasing. This point here, has a name that makes no sense. It's called the minimum efficient scale, and you'll see why it kind of makes no sense in a little bit. I'll talk about it a bit later. But that's its name. Don't worry too much about that for now. So what we're going to focus on now is this zone here, zone 2. In zone 1, the firm has the economies of scale, internal economies of scale that we talked about before. But now, as the firm itself expands, we're saying what might happen is that your average costs get driven up, your short run average cost curve finishes higher and higher and higher, meaning the long run average cost curve is pushed upwards, and the firm faces higher unit costs as a result of an expansion. So an internal diseconomies of scale is an increase in average cost resulting from an increase in the firm's capacity. And that's what we mean by an internal diseconomy of scale. So why might this happen? There are kind of 4 classic reasons that big businesses tend to face problems. So one is issues with communication. There's just more people. When there are more people, what that tends to mean is that things are slower. You may have to rely on things like email instead of speaking to people, as a result of which mistakes get made, productivity is damaged, everything takes longer, and therefore the cost per unit, average cost, goes up. Just because productivity falls and things take longer. Secondly, it's harder to coordinate your resources. All I mean is it's hard to get things, get resources, e.g. supplies, for example, in the right place at the right time, because the organization is much more complex. So it's much harder to get supplies in the right place at the right time. So therefore, there's a danger that you kind of run out of stock. You run out of components, and therefore that slows down your production line. Somebody has to run out and buy some more, something like that, because it's just such a complex organization. Thirdly, there are problems with control. So it's much harder to know exactly what everybody is doing in this organization. It's big. There's a lot of people. Again, a lot of resources. As a result of which, it's potentially going to be possible, that that we have kind of lazy employees that we don't really know what they're doing, or that we start getting, kind of theft, because again we can't control, we don't have good procedures to control what's going on. And lastly, it's entirely possible that in large organizations, people feel less engaged. That in big organizations, what happens is that motivation falls. You just feel like you're part of a giant machine, Once that happens, yeah, then what happens is that maybe effort levels fall, yeah, or maybe what's called labour turnover increases. That's the number of people who are leaving. Yeah, then you've got to pay to replace them. Yeah, or maybe just people are more likely, to take time off sick. Yeah, we have absenteeism. All of those things drive up your costs and reduce productivity. So all those things potentially lead to internal diseconomies of scale. But I think the main point about these is they're all really, diseconomies of scale for the most part. They're all related to management. And good management can avoid most of these problems. So, for example, you can decentralize your organization to try to avoid some of the communication problems. It's possible to have performance schemes for your staff, or you can design the workplace so that it's an attractive place. If you look at someone like Google, then the workplace in which although it's a big organization, I don't think they suffer from problems of demotivation because of the way they pay people, the way they lay out their workplace, and so on. So with effective management, diseconomies of scale should be avoidable. And as a result, what you see is that in a lot of large organizations, research into big manufacturing firms suggests that you tend to end up with an average cost curve that looks a bit like that in reality. That initially we can get economies of scale, but after that most firms can avoid them. So we avoid diseconomies of scale via effective management techniques. And that phrase that I talked to you about before, the idea of a minimum efficient scale, it becomes much clearer on this diagram what the idea of a minimum efficient scale really means. It's not the minimum cost, it's the minimum scale. In other words, a firm at Q1 is efficient, a firm at Q2 is also efficient, a firm at Q3 is efficient, a firm at Q4 is efficient. All these firms, they have different scales, but they all have the same unit cost of C1. So the minimum refers to the scale. What it's showing is it is the smallest scale, the smallest size that a firm can have. So the smallest scale a firm can have and still be efficient. And by efficient in this context, I mean still be able to minimize its costs. So when you hear minimum efficient scale, it's a bit of a strange phrase. I mean, on this diagram, the phrase minimum efficient scale is clearly stupid because there is only one efficient scale. I mean, it's stupid to say that's the lowest because there is only one scale at which you can be efficient. It only really makes sense on this diagram, where we're saying all of those scales are efficient, but that is the one that is the smallest you can be. So in principle then, we can have internal economies of scale as we expand. As we expand further, we might get internal diseconomies of scale, but with good management techniques, these internal diseconomies of scale are avoidable.